Close to the top, we reached a point from where I saw a gate, and I saw the silent figure of someone on guard. I slowly raised my eyes. I saw that he was sitting on the highest step, his face too splendid for my eyes. I looked away, and in his hand he held a naked sword. So dazzling were the rays reflected thence, each time I tried to look I could not see. Falling devoutly at his holy feet, in mercy's name I begged to be let in, but first of all 3 times I smote my breast. Then with his sword he traced upon my brow the scars of 7 P's. Once entered here, be sure you cleanse away these wounds, he said.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we're opening up our cluster on education with Dante's Purgatorio.
It's a very interesting take on education. It makes me think a little bit about the ways in which we did the Aeneid, also a sort of a very big book in all kinds of ways, but under the theme of sports. So doing the Purgatory under education is, I think, kind of a neat sideways way to come at it.
And it's an interesting time to be talking about education and approaches to education and theories of education, because the way that we've educated children and adults is changing so radically right now, or is potentially changing so radically right now, as so much has to be moved online. Or if not online, if it's happening in person, it carries a much greater amount of anxiety for a lot of people.
Yeah, people, I find myself constantly caught between 2 feelings. One is deep concern and compassion for the kind of suffering that people are dealing with as we're in the time we're in. But I'm also absolutely fascinated by it, like looking at what's going on and thinking, what are the things that have changed? What are the things that are going to continue to be this way? And what are the things we're going to want to leave behind us as quickly as possible? And I feel like education is one of these areas where people are looking at it and thinking about it consciously in a way that they often don't need to do. So thinking especially of parents or caregivers of children who would normally be in school, who are now dealing with having their kids at home or having different kinds of schedules or whatever it is they're dealing with. We're having to disambiguate the childcare function of education from education itself, right? And I think people normally don't tease those apart. And similarly, if we talk about colleges and universities and post-secondary education, people are really thinking about, what is it for? You know, what are the valuable parts? What do we mean when we're talking about education? So it's a neat time to, I think, reflect on this.
So let's start with a little bit of that just from a personal level. You have a PhD. You've been teaching in higher education for a few years now. Mm-hmm. And I guess, first of all, I should ask, because not all academics go into it in order to be educators. Do you think of yourself as an academic, as primarily an educator, or as somebody who's primarily research, but was dragged kicking and screaming into educating? Or, how does education as an educator play out for you? And then, what do you remember? How do you draw upon your experiences being educated as a student who is a student for many, many years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The first thing I would say is, thinking of my own experience of education, I hated school. I just really hated school with a burning passion. I didn't dislike my classmates or my teachers as human beings, but I just found it really boring and I was just very unhappy. And so there's that, right? And then getting to university was really great because all of a sudden it was a lot more interesting because you had a freedom as to what you would study. You could choose your courses. You could choose what you were going to spend time on. So I came to really love it. And I figured out very early on that I would like to sort of do an academic career. And that was for a couple different reasons. One of them was because I just really enjoyed reading and writing and studying and thinking and having conversations. I think a lot of people do. But also I knew from a very young age I wanted to have children. And I knew that there were certain careers where it would be very, very difficult to have children. And then there are certain careers where you would work hard, but you had a flexible schedule. You could structure your schedule around your life to some extent. And I knew that, being a professor, working in a university was that kind of career. So I knew I wanted to do that very early on. And so when I went to graduate school, I knew I loved research. And I thought, well, if I have to teach, I can teach. I'll learn to do that and I'll try to do a good job of it. But I had no interest in it. But once I started doing it, I found I loved it. I loved being in the classroom, and I just loved that feeling of, seeing people think and, midwifing that a little bit. Like I just got really excited and took a huge amount of pleasure in that. So that was really good. So I came to really love both the research side and the teaching side, and to feel very much that one nourished the other. Like I was a better teacher because I was actively engaged in research, and I was better at my research. Not so much better at the research, but better at the writing up of the research because I was teaching, because being in the classroom would teach me how to generalize or how to choose a good example, so they were very mutually nourishing. But what's weird now, more recently, is I've moved to a new position where it's just a research position. So there's no teaching, and you might think, oh, that's just great, but actually I miss it a lot. And I find myself trying to think of different ways to satisfy the desire to teach. So it's been a path that's changed a lot, not just in the distant past, but also quite recently.
I have to say, I had a very similar relationship to my education growing up. I did not enjoy school very much until perhaps I got to college. But even then, I was the sort of person who skipped classes in order to go learn things at the library on my own. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've always had that fairly autodidactic approach to learning, doing it for my own reasons, on my own terms, in my own ways as much as possible, which, is great and self-motivating in some ways, and also means I make a lot of dumb mistakes for a long time. So
yeah, no, I think we're very similar in that, with a lot of passion to learn if it's something you want to do. But if it's something that lies outside, I find it really hard to bring myself to that.
Do you think of Dante as someone who was more interested in educating or being educated?
What an interesting question. He seems like someone, we were talking about people who are autodidacts, right? You're describing yourself that way. Dante certainly seems like that kind of person, also the sort of person with a very strong sense of his own, correctness, like the accuracy of his own opinion.
Yep.
So make of that what you will.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that assessment. And, he certainly likes showing off some knowledge that he's picked up in his poetry. And I think we'll encounter some of that. So there are many, many different translations of Purgatorio out there. Which one are you reading?
Well, I would have said, if you had asked me a couple of weeks ago, I would be reading Charles Singleton's translation, which I mentioned when we did the Inferno. It's a prose translation, but it's very, very literal, and it has a facing page, Italian on the left, English translation on the right. And I just really like Singleton. But my copy of it is literally fallen to pieces. And by literally fallen to pieces, I mean, like, there are only small sections of 20 to 40 pages here and there that stick together, and the rest of them are just like loose pieces of paper. So I have to order a new copy of that. So instead, I read the one I think is the same one that you're reading, which is Mark Musa's translation.
Yeah, I reread Mark Musa's translation. I'm really growing to like it, I think.
What do you like about it? Like, I don't dislike his translation, but what is it you especially like about it?
I think it gets a really nice balance between being very lofty and being very clear. Mm-hmm. Being very musical and being very, clear. Mm-hmm. I think he really does value getting the point across. Some of the mid-20th century translators of the classics often end up elevating it to a point where it just sounds weird.
Yeah. I think with Singleton, it's not that he's trying to elevate it, but that it's a very literal translation. Like, it's a really good translation if you can read at least some of the Italian, because he's really working to keep the syntax in order.
Well, yeah, and that's a perfectly good thing to do if for a particular audience. And yeah. And I'm not saying that there aren't good moments in that translation, just reading it sort of for the sake of reading it. But Musa's translation is the Penguin Classics translation, and I think is a pretty good one.
And he handles the verse form really well, I think. It doesn't feel clunky at all.
No, he's not trying to make it rhyme, so he has the advantage of that. Mm-hmm. And there's a sort of musicality and flexibility to the line that I think is pretty good. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't know what I'm looking for in a Dante translation. Yeah. Beyond good footnotes and getting me from point A to point B, and occasional passages that make me go, ooh.
Normally, this is the point where we would want to introduce Dante and talk a little bit about his biography. But I feel like because we've done that earlier when we did our episode on the Inferno, we need to say much less about that than we would normally do. And maybe we could just talk a little bit about the Purgatorio itself and its place within the Divine Comedy.
Yeah, go back and listen to that other episode if you feel like you need to know a bit more about who Dante was. We'll wait. Okay, now you're back. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was a good episode, I think. Let's talk about what happens next in the Divine Comedy. So, as you'll recall, previously in the Divine Comedy, in the Inferno, Dante was given a tour through hell. He passed all sorts of people, well, the incorporeal shades of people, who were being punished for their sins in life, with punishments that were specifically designed to be appropriate for the sins that they had committed. So hell was a place of grotesque tortures, but one that Dante needed to learn the importance of if he was going to get to finish his tour and ultimately see heaven, and I guess become a better person. His guide on the tour was, of course, Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, which we looked at recently. Virgil was lodged in limbo just outside of hell with the quote-unquote noble pagans because he had died just a few years before Jesus was born, so he never got a chance to become a good Christian. And yet, Virgil had written a poem, his fourth eclogue, which was widely read, especially in the Middle Ages, as predicting Jesus' birth. So he was an appropriate guide, at least for this leg of the journey. Okay, so Dante and Virgil have gone through the entirety of hell. They found Satan at his core. They climbed up Satan, and they finally emerged from the underworld to a spot in the southern hemisphere, the only part of the southern hemisphere that has any land at all, we're told. A spot that is directly opposite on the globe to Jerusalem. And this mountainous rock is Purgatory, which we explore in this third of the poem. Purgatory is where people who sinned a bit spend some time to get completely ready to go to heaven. Now, instead of the punishments of hell, here it's perhaps more of a self-help course, where you work on your sins rather than suffer for them. So as Dante enters, an angel marks his forehead with 7 P's. That is to say, the letter P for the Latin word peccatum, which means sin. And indeed, this time, we're going to see how people learn to deal with or get past these 7 deadly sins, which you may remember, or you may not. Either way, it's fine. They are pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. These marks on his forehead will be erased as Dante completes each segment of the journey. Along the way, he meets another guide, Statius, who is a Roman poet who lived shortly after Virgil and who I believe wrote largely in his shadow. But after completing the gauntlet of the 7 sins, Dante, Virgil, and Statius will reach the top of the mountain where the Garden of Eden lies. Now this is as far as Virgil can take him, but soon Dante will meet his next guide, Beatrice, the object of his earthly love, who died quite young, and who will be his guide through the next section of the poem in Paradiso, which I guess we'll do next year.
Yeah, I want to say, tune in next time.
Yes, to be continued.
Yeah. And, one of the things that we talked about a little bit in our earlier episode on the Inferno, that maybe it's worth returning to now, is how, on the one hand, we have these 3 different parts, these 3/3 of the whole Divine Comedy. And in that sense, they all are equivalent, but they're very different. Like their flavors are very, very different. And so it's not a coincidence that the Inferno is the one that gets taught by far more the most often. If you're just going to get a part of the Divine Comedy, that's the one that you're going to read. And we talked a little bit about why that might be. Is it more accessible? Is it less complicated? I don't think so. It's super complicated, but it's also very affective. Like it rouses your emotions in all kinds of ways. In ways that the Purgatorio and the Paradiso don't quite so much. Like certainly the Paradiso is very abstract, and that's something that doesn't repel the reader exactly, but it's harder for the reader.
It might repel some readers. Let's be fair. It's hard. Yeah, probably true.
No, but the Purgatorio, though, is like you tend to bounce off the surface of it in a way that I don't think you do the Inferno. At the same time, it's really interesting.
Oh, see, I kind of have the opposite sense of it because I was feeling this time. The Inferno is a bit much. Like it's really trying hard to impress you with its over-the-top gothness, with its terrible tortures. It's super extra. Oh my God, it's so much. Whereas Purgatory is really pleasant.
No.
It's like Purgatory is, I don't want to quite say it's the Animal Crossing if I'm going to make video game metaphors of the Commedia, but it's definitely the sort of the chill place where people have problems still. So there's still some narrative interest, unlike Paradiso, where everything is pretty much perfect. People are still working on their problems, but...
Well, it's a place of change.
Absolutely. It's a place of change, but there isn't the sort of high stakes. Like it's still kind of nice.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know if I'd say it isn't high stakes because like one of the things you said too, when you're summarizing the plot, you're saying how these are people who like that they've sinned a bit, like they've sinned a certain amount. Actually, some of them have sinned kind of a lot. I mean, or at least we're told this. Actually, I don't know if we see this, but we're told this. So, for example, when Dante meets Manfredi in Canto 3, he introduces himself and he says, "Horrible was the nature of my sins, but boundless mercy stretches out its arms to any man who comes in search of it." And there's some evidence that there are a number of murders that Manfredi might have been behind, politically motivated murders. So we don't see an account or a summary of the kinds of crimes he might have committed, as we do, for example, in the Inferno with Ugolino, where we get a pretty clear sense of what kind of background he has, right? What sort of experience in the world he had. But we're told that these are grave sins. But the reason that they're in the Purgatorio is not because their sins weren't too bad. The reason they're there is because if you're sorry, even if it's at the very end, if you cry out to Mary or you cry out to Jesus or you even just open up your heart in some way, that's the thing that gets you into the place of change instead of the place of permanent suffering.
But that's just it. There's something somewhat comforting about how there's still a chance and we're not dwelling so much. You're right. Like, these are people who've probably done terrible things, and like, I guess the question is, should they be canceled or should they be given another chance? And this is, coming from a religious tradition that is really interested in the possibility of redemption.
I was going to say, it's weird because, you remember when we were in the Inferno in Canto 3 and there's that gate, there's that sign over the gate that's like, "Through me,
Abandon all hope, all ye who enter me."
Yeah, through me is this, through me is that, through me is eternal torment. Abandon all hope, all you who enter. And then it says, "Justice made me in the divine love." Like, in other words, mercy is built into the structure of not just the Inferno, but the whole structure. And now we're in the domain of mercy.
Right, exactly. And on a more, I guess, meta level, the Inferno feels like Dante gleefully putting people that he knew and didn't like in terrible situations.
Yeah, definitely.
And you don't have as much of this anymore. That aspect of the Inferno, which just turns me off entirely.
Payback time.
Is completely absent. So now you get people who have problems, but like they're, in a sense, they're treated as human beings. I mean, maybe I'm just not taking away the lessons that I'm supposed to be taking away from the Inferno about acknowledging how desperately terrible these people are and how they need this and how this is all right and good. I don't know. That's not why I'm reading it, to get that kind of lesson. But nevertheless, there is something more pleasant about hanging out with generally nice people who are trying to work on their problems.
Yeah. I mean, the Inferno and Paradiso are completely static, but the Purgatorio opens up the possibility of going from one state to another state. So it's not just Dante and his guide Virgil who are moving through this landscape. It's everybody is moving through the landscape, and sometimes slower, sometimes faster. Sometimes you have to wait in this place or that place, in anti-purgatory or on one of the terraces. But as soon as you fulfill your obligations, as soon as you fulfill your sort of required penitence, that's when you move on up to your permanent place, the place you'll stay in Paradiso.
There's a section about that I really enjoyed. I think it's when Statius is introduced, but I could be misremembering. But it's an area where the people who arrive are reluctant to fix their sins, but they are made to want to get better. I guess that is the kind of coercion that is going on. But then they wait there prostrate until such time comes as they feel they are ready to get up and move on. And it's that sense of they'll know, like it's entirely up to them.
Yeah, you'll know.
When you've done this. No one is going to make you do that. They're just going to make you want to improve. And there's something much more lovely about that notion, says the autodidact, than the externally enforced punishments of the Inferno.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it, right? I mean, there's two things that are dramatically different there. One is that you said there's these punishments that come from outside, where there's these, demons of the underworld that torment the people who are suffering in the Inferno. Here, there may be like suffering, like there are people who have their eyelids sewn shut. There are people who are weighed down by terribly heavy weights. There's a whole range of kinds of purgative punishments, right, that are happening, right? But they're meant to get people to another point so that in a self-motivated kind of way, right, or self-willed kind of way, they're then able to move on. And when I say self-willed, it is self-willed in the sense that that whole language of the will is really fundamental to how Dante describes this process. But more and more as we move through the comedy, and especially once you get to Paradiso, it's made clear to us that nobody is able to sort of totally independently will to do something, that ultimately the will to do things is coming from God and it's coming through you in some way, right? So like in the same way that the natural world is understood to be created, right? And so the flowering and growth that happens in the annual cycle doesn't come from the plant itself, right? In this way of understanding the world, it comes from the sort of the divine act of creation that is reiterated year by year by year in the annual cycles of growth. So too, there's this idea that the will, right, the divine will plays out again and again in these individual souls. And that's why we get all that language of growth and greenness specifically throughout the Purgatorio, which I find absolutely fascinating.
I hadn't noticed the greenness, and you mentioned it right before we started recording.
Oh my God, it's everywhere.
Yeah. So tell me more about the greenness.
Well, it's neat. I mean, it sort of like comes out over and over and over again. One of the first places we see it is in Canto 4, when, again, we have this figure of Manfredi, who was a ruler, who's a son of Frederick II, an illegitimate son of Frederick II, who was recognized and had claim to the throne of Sicily, and because of some political machinations, had to defend it, loses in the battle to defend it. And he was at that time excommunicated. He was, thought to be guilty of a whole range of crimes, including sort of like bumping off different family members. But he's there in the Purgatorio because he repented before death. And in the passage where he's talking about how mercy is always there, even for people you would imagine would be shut off from mercy, he uses this language of greenness. Let's see if I can find it. He says, talking about excommunication, he says, "The church's curse is not the final word, for everlasting love may still return if hope reveals the slightest hint of green." Right? So here he's talking about the capacity to be saved as a kind of greenness. Like you might see a bush that looks like it's almost dead, but you break one of the branches and you see that there's still like a little bit of life left in it. And then this language shows up again and again in other places as well. So in Canto 7, when we hear a description of one area within Anti-Purgatory, which is called the Valley of the Princes, there's this beautiful description of this landscape. It's absolutely luscious. He says, "Think of fine silver, gold, cochineal, white lead, Indian wood, glowing and deeply clear, fresh emerald the instant it is split. The brilliant colors of the grass and flowers within that dale would outshine all of these, as nature naturally surpasses art." And it goes on. So this idea of grass and then the fresh emerald. And so it's like a natural environment, right? It's grass and flowers, but it's also got this kind of artificial or bejeweled quality to it. And then we see this emerald again later on when Beatrice shows up and her eyes are said to be emerald, right? And then another point in Canto 8, some of the angels that appear periodically throughout the Purgatorio to facilitate Dante's passage along with Virgil from place to place. In Canto 8, they're said to be green. Their garments green as tender newborn leaves unfurling, billowed out behind each one, fanned by the greenness of their streaming wings, right? And so this isn't just like green like any old green. It's always green, like growing green, right? So like when Manfredi, hope reveals the slightest hint of green. The garments are green like newborn leaves, like fresh leaves. Even the ways that souls are described in the underworld evokes this language of growth and vegetation. So for example, in Canto 19, Dante is talking to one of the popes he finds down in the underworld, Pope Adrian, and he says to him, "Spirit in whom weeping makes ripe that without which no one returns to God." And then he goes on. So this idea that the suffering, right? The weeping that you do in Purgatory is what makes you ripe, right? So you're almost like a fruit on a tree. So all this language, even to the very last lines of the Purgatorio, it's this language of new foliage and growth. He says, "From those holiest waters I returned to her, reborn, a tree renewed, in bloom with newborn foliage, immaculate." Right? So this is the quality in the Purgatorio that I find really compelling. This idea that it's like a new creation, it's like a new beginning, and in that way, it's totally different from the other two parts of the Divine Comedy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's very much about the potential for change and improvement within everyone. It's a space where you get to explore that. It's also the space of the Commedia that takes place on Earth. Mm-hmm. It takes place on a very different part of Earth, and most of the people who are taking part in it, except for Dante and I guess some angels, are dead people, are shades, are incorporeal beings. walking up. But nevertheless, you get the sense that this is happening because it's on Earth, because Earth is the place where that kind of change is possible.
Well, where growth happens, right? Because it's the place of mutability, right? Like if you think about medieval cosmology, right? There's this idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe, and then there's all these spheres around it, right? So the moon, the sun, the planets, the sphere of fire, the Empyrean, all that stuff, right? So things that are below the sphere of the moon are changeable, are immutable. And everything that's beyond that partakes of eternity, has a certain kind of stability to it. So purgatory has to be on Earth because it participates in that. And it's neat how it's also a kind of a taking off point, right? It's a mountain down in the southern hemisphere. And when you go to the very top of the mountain of purgatory, what do you find? Interestingly enough, right? The place of origins, which is going to be Dante's takeoff point. It's the Garden of Eden. The idea being that when God made it inaccessible after the fall, he put it at the very top of purgatory, where you're definitely not going to stumble on it, right?
So I have a question now. In these medieval cosmographies, where is hell?
Well, by cosmography, I meant like when they draw it schematically. So there are some medieval illuminations where you'll see this, where it's sort of drawing out the cosmology. So you've got the circle of the Earth at the center, and then, the spheres all around them. And then the circle of the Earth is itself kind of made up of spheres, because the idea, so medieval physics, right, understands the world being made up of 4 elements. So earth, water, air, and fire. And the reason fire goes up, or like bubbles go up in the air, people thought, was because those elements, air and the fire, want to go to their natural elemental home, right? So if you have a rock and you drop it, it falls down because the elemental place of matter is, toward the center, right? So these drawings of the medieval cosmos will sometimes actually draw the Earth as having these 4 layers to it, as it were, right? The layer of earth, the layer of water, the layer of air, and the layer of fire. And if they show the underworld, they'll draw it as a part of that innermost circle, right? That innermost sphere. But these are like different cosmologies kind of being mapped on top of one another. So where the heavenly spheres are might appear there, but then also the material parts of the world might appear there. And also that sort of eschatological mapping might be happening too, where you see the underworld. But in terms of like mapping the heavens and things like that, right? It's a little bit trickier, right? Because they understand the heavens to be at the periphery, right? So it's sort of both a destination in that sense, kind of fixed, but it's also like everywhere. As there's this, you probably know, there's this famous quotation that shows up in the writing of this 12th century writer, Alan of Lille, in his sermon on the intelligible sphere. He doesn't make this up, but he writes it in a beautiful way. He says, God is an intelligible sphere whose circumference is nowhere and whose center is everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? So you can see how that paradoxical kind of nature of the divine shows up in cosmology in a way that you can't really draw, but you can imagine. And it's crazy, isn't it? I love the Middle Ages.
Yeah. I mean, I asked because I was thinking about that distinction you were making between things being changeable, within Earth's sphere, so to speak, and then being immutable outside in the upper worlds and in heaven and so forth. And then like hell being within Earth is interesting on that. But of course, that may or may not have been as literal a sense of where things are as we sometimes want to read it as, or as Dante is depicting it as, right?
Well, I mean, I don't like to generalize about like the medieval mind or anything like that, right? But like there's this desire to have a kind of a system, like everything should fit in the system. And there are places where one part of it really bumps up against another part of it. So this idea of cosmology and the elements and so on really bumps up against those geographies of the world that are eschatological, right? That have to do with salvation. They have to do with heaven and hell and good and bad and, God and Satan and so on, right? Like, these bump up against these sort of more physics oriented kinds of models of the world and the whole cosmos. So they make it all fit together, but some of the joins show and some of them don't show quite so much.
Now, this may have sounded like a bit of a tangent from discussing the Purgatory, but this is the sort of thing Dante gets really excited about.
Oh my God, yes.
He's so excited to have his character be in the southern hemisphere where no human has ever been, according to his understanding of the world. And he's constantly interrupting with observations about how the world is different in the southern hemisphere based on, there's different constellations out there.
It blows his mind, right?
He's so excited that he has to be, told by Virgil, no, get back on the road. We need to keep walking. There's more important things afoot. But yeah, he is just eager to talk about that kind of scientific understanding of geography.
Yeah, and other kinds of natural phenomena as well. There's this one moment when Dante and Virgil encounter Statius, right? This other poet who you mentioned earlier. And Statius goes on this like long excursus about embryology.
Oh,
like,
it's so not what I was expecting.
It's kind of charming. I mean, it starts because Dante has some particular question about, I don't even remember what it is anymore.
They're in the sphere of the gluttonous, and so you've got people who are on a dramatic weight loss plan, I guess. But he's trying to figure out how they can become so lean, since anyway they have no need for food. And then this ends up being a discussion of blood.
What it becomes is a discussion of basically like human biology, like completely. Like he explains how blood works and how sperm is formed out of the blood, and then also how conception takes place when these two different bloods meet.
Yeah, because he doesn't refer to it as sperm.
No. But he's talking about spermatogenesis, right? He's giving you sort of an account of human physiology.
But he keeps calling it blood. He keeps calling it putting blood in someone else, and that's really upsetting to me.
No, it's okay, I swear. But he's giving you an account of how these different, what they called in medieval medicine, they call like different forms of digestion take place. Like we talk about digestion, we're always talking about food being digested in your belly, right? But they talk about all these various biological processes or physiological processes as forms of digestion. And the spermatogenesis is one of those things they understand is also a kind of digestion, right? From the blood. Anyway, whatever. And so he gives an account of this and how these come together. And then, conception happens. You have a kind of clot. And then it reaches the stage of the jellyfish. It moves and feels.
That's
then organs start. I know. Then organs start to form, and he goes on, blah, blah, blah. And then he talks about the different parts of the mental faculties and how over time, once conception has happened, they gradually become associated with this organism. And then, it finally, it goes on forever.
And then what happens after you die? He talks about after Lachesis, the fate runs out of flax and the soul is free to flesh and takes with it, etc. And then like what happens to all of these bodily functions that have made the person? Because the story isn't over when you're dead, of course. Mm-hmm. And so this is how we explain the sort of biology, would you call it, of the shades and how they react with food and how they react with other physical needs.
Exactly. So, I mean, in some ways you could say, oh, well, this is a really necessary explanation for something that we haven't had fully explicated earlier. But it also is one of those moments that really feels like what you were describing as Dante's digressiveness. Like these digressions are useful and valuable and so on, but they're also like, I don't know, mini lessons, right? They're like, give you sort of detailed insights into whole systems of knowledge. In other words, in that passage from Statius, you get like a whole sense of an understanding of how the body works and how the mind works and how the soul is connected to it and how that whole life cycle of the human being involving both body and soul unfolds in time. So it's neat.
Now, do you think that Dante feels that this is something that a person needs to learn in order to progress into heaven? Or is this a distraction from progressing to heaven?
Well, it's something he gets taught in the Purgatorio. I don't know that the souls that are there, undergoing purgation get taught that, right? I mean, right. On the one hand, he's traversing the path that everybody else is traversing. But he's exceptional. And we get reminded of this over and over again throughout the Purgatorio when he meets people and their mind is blown. Like he meets these shades and they're like, oh my God, you have a shadow. So his experience is in some ways extremely different. It's unique, right? Because he's this exceptional case that comes into the afterworld or the other world, but is alive. Right. So the educational stuff is for him. And as we move through the Purgatorio, his journey is more and more, I don't want to say individual. It's not just individual. It's like personal, especially once we get farther along and he gets to the point where Beatrice shows up. Right.
Yeah, that's obviously just for him.
It's just for him. She's his, I want to say personal Jesus, right? She's his personal path.
Actually, yeah.
Well, she's his personal path to salvation. Right. And so you have to ask, what is that? Does everyone have a personal path? In some ways it's universal and shared. And Dante is like a new Adam or something like he's like an everyman, right? But it's also very, very personal and very private and very individual. And so you got to wonder, is it like that for each person? Is each person's path different in this model?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because Dante really insists that you're going to identify with him in his love for Beatrice, right? He's written other poems about his love for Beatrice, but she is meant to stand in for love itself.
Yeah. And you get, I think, a beautiful insight into that when she appears. He says, although many years had passed since last I stood trembling before her eyes, captured by adoration, stunned by awe, my soul, that could not see her perfectly, still felt, succumbing to her mystery and power, the strength of its enduring love. No sooner were my eyes struck by the force of the high piercing virtue I had known before I quit my boyhood years than I turned to the left, with all the confidence that makes a child run to its mother's arms when he's frightened or needs comforting, to say to Virgil, not one drop of blood is left inside my veins that does not throb. I recognize signs of that ancient flame. But Virgil was not there. We found ourselves without Virgil, sweet father, Virgil to whom for my salvation I gave up my soul. And then he weeps. And Beatrice says, Dante, though Virgil leaves you, do not weep. Not yet, that is, for you shall have to weep from yet another wound. Do not weep yet. There's a lot going on there, right? I mean, the moment I was thinking of, though, and I think really speaks to what we're talking about, is I recognize signs of that ancient flame, because he's quoting Virgil there.
Right.
And it's a really interesting moment that he's quoting. So when he sees Beatrice, he's like, oh, I recognize signs of that ancient flame. In other words, I felt this warmth before, right? This love, this passion before, right? But it's a line that he's actually sort of quoting. I mean, it's in Italian, but he's quoting basically Virgil's Latin. And this happens in book 4 of the Aeneid when Dido has just gotten to know Aeneas. She's heard him tell his own story, his backstory in books 2 and 3, and she's feeling something. And that's when she's like, I felt this ancient flame before. And what she's talking about is she's been in love before. She was married before, her husband's dead. So that passion that she knows what it is when she feels it. She's like, oh, I know what this feeling is. And it's just really interesting when Dante uses that line again too, right? So one of the things it's doing is it's like connecting this poem with Virgil's Aeneid. And there's a lot to say about that relationship of the two books, right? But then also, on the one hand, it's weird that he's associating himself with Dido. Also a lot to say about that, right? But then also Dido is talking about just like passion, right? For one man and then for another man. But Dante is talking about Beatrice, who he loved on earth, and now he loves still here in the afterworld, right? So it's really interesting how it's parallel and yet different in all these weird and unnerving kinds of ways. And it's a really, really powerful moment too, because this is the moment when he sees Beatrice. Her first word to him is Dante. It's his name, right? It's the one time his name shows up in the poem.
Oh, right. Oh, yes. Okay.
And it's that moment when Virgil disappears. So all this stuff happens all right in that same moment. Bobby really appreciated that. I have to go put him outside.
Well, that seems like a lovely place to leave Beatrice and Dante until we meet up with them again, should we do the Paradiso someday. But a while back, you talked about the eyes being sewn shut of some of the people in Purgatory and how they were sewn shut. This is a thing that apparently was done for falcons. If you're trying to train them, you sew their eyes shut so they don't get so distracted. I'm not quite sure. I don't really understand it. I don't do falcons, but that was part of the learning process. So it's a temporary measure on the body. Still sounds kind of awful, but it's a temporary thing that it leads to a kind of education. And it was one of the most bodily of the forms of education that you found in Purgatorio. You mentioned a few others being weighed down, etc., being prostrated, I guess. But it's nothing like how bodily everything was in hell. Purgatory, there's a lot of other types of educative material around. There's a lot of sort of exemplars and examples. You've got audio guides as you're walking by as Cain shouts things out about his own particular type of sin, and then other people say their stories. You've got visions that people have when they're sleeping and can't travel because it's too dangerous, I guess, to travel when you're sleeping. And so you have visions, and then all sorts of people show up in these visions that offer moral lessons about their lives. And you've also got, in one particular section, you've got carvings on the ground in the section on pride, because part of the way that you counteract pride is to be willing to look down. And if you're looking down, there's carvings on the ground that give you these exempla about prideful people and how that wasn't so good for them. So you have all these different types of educational materials, formats of educational materials that I found really interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I had thought it before as educational materials, but that's exactly right. There are ways in which, under pride, you see these carvings that are down low. So you're looking down. That's what lets you see those carvings. A little later on, there are exemplary kinds of narratives that people hear, little snatches of these exemplary narratives, right? So it's the sense of vision, the sense of hearing, the visionary experience that comes at night. There are all these different ways in which your senses participate in that educational journey. And on the threshold of that is when we first move into the 7 terraces of Purgatory, right? So Purgatory is structured so that we have this opening area, it's sort of a big waiting room that's subdivided into a few different areas. It's often called anti-Purgatory, right? So it's the waiting area. And then there's these 7 terraces that people, are purged of their different sins. Dante is going to move through them. And then at the very end, you get to the earthly paradise, right? So, but as we first enter into these 7 terraces, we pass through a gate, and then we see a kind of bank, a kind of decorated wall area, right, in that first terrace. It's made of pure white marble, and it's got beautiful carvings on it. And I find that section incredibly interesting because it's an example of something we've talked about before. I think we talked about it when we were reading the Aeneid, and we might have talked about it a little bit when we did the Iliad. This thing that's called Ekphrasis. And I know you know what it is, but I don't know if everybody else finds it as utterly absorbing as I do, which is, in general, it just means the depiction of one mode of art through another mode of art. So if you saw, for example, a painting that included other paintings in it, those would be ekphrastic, right? So there's just a whole bunch of different ways of talking about it. But when you're talking about literature, typically what you're talking about with ekphrasis is the description in words of an art object. So it might be a painting, it might be a building, like an architectural structure, it might be a statue, it could be any of these things. And so in the Aeneid, for example, we saw the temple in book 1. Aeneas looks at the temple and he sees these wall paintings that are depicting the fall of Troy. And we talked about how it's a really extraordinary, I want to say extraordinary moment, but it's like a series of moments where he looks and he sees people and places he knows. So he sees Hector, he sees Priam, he sees these different figures, and then he sees himself. And it's this really uncanny kind of moment of recognition and big feelings, you know what I mean? I can't even enumerate them because he's got so many different feelings that are summed up by this ekphrastic moment. And so that moment in the Aeneid is very much in the background for Dante, but other examples too are in that background because in the Middle Ages, quite a number of writers use ekphrasis. They find it really interesting and they use it in really weird ways. So this is an example of that. And it's got 3 episodes. One of them is a depiction of the incarnation. So it's when the Virgin Mary is there and the angel comes to her. And Dante describes it this way. And here I'm reading from Charles Singleton's translation. The angel appeared so vividly graven in gentle mien that it seemed not a silent image. One would have sworn that he was saying Ave, for there she was imaged who turned the key to open the supreme love, and these words were imprinted in her attitude, Ecce ancilla Dei, as expressly as a figure is stamped on wax. And then the second one is, there's 3 images here. The second one shows King David, and it's him dancing before the Ark of the Covenant. And there are other people there too, also singing and dancing. And this is what Dante says. He says, there were people divided into 7 choirs that made 2 of my senses say, the one, no, the other, yes, they are singing, right? So it seems like they're singing, but then the other sense says, no, they can't possibly be actually singing. But he's looking at this art, right? And then there's another image there. It's Trajan, the emperor, with women begging him to show mercy to them and help them in a terrible situation that they're undergoing. And there's a whole exchange between the woman who is speaking to the Emperor Trajan and his responses. The woman seemed to say, my lord, do me vengeance for my son who is slain. And he seemed to answer her, wait now till I return. And she, my lord, like one whose grief is urgent, and if you do not return, and he who shall be in my place will do it for you. And it goes on. It's like a whole long exchange. I mean, the reason this fascinates me so much is, and it's so such an odd example of ekphrasis, is that it's as if it's speaking. It's as if it's out loud, as if you can hear what you see. So anybody who ever experiences synesthesia will probably also be really excited by this kind of passage because it's pushes all of those buttons where, one sense is is speaking to you through another sense. And very much near the end of that, Dante describes what he sees there as visibile parlare, visible speech, So I find it to be fascinating itself, but then also clearly Dante sees it as a really powerful way to describe the nature of everything that's going to come after this, right? We're going to be in an environment where all of your senses are mobilized and you're not limited by the boundaries that normally separate out our senses.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? Normally we have sight over here and hearing over here, but here it's all together in this environment of education.
That's a really interesting way of putting it. When I was reading this, I was thinking about how this is just an example of like a wonder, right? You're in a place created by God or angels or whatever, but like it is created with a divine force. That means that when you look at it, it is as if you can hear the singing. It is so well carved that you are there, that it trips up your senses. In other words, that was the miraculousness of the craftsmanship. But this idea that, no, this is actually a lead-in to the bleed over of the different types of sensory input that are going to play off each other and all cooperate to get this meaning across is a really interesting one. I hadn't quite thought of it that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. I think that we're in this like tipping point where we're just beyond what you normally experience. Like, I don't know if you've ever had this kind of experience, but I remember being really weirded out once. I was in the British Museum and I don't remember which, it was some wall panels. I think they were ancient Greek wall panels. I don't remember which ones it was. And they were depictions of warfare. And I think, not alone in the room, but there were only a few people there. And it was early in the morning. I think I was jet lagged, right? So I was tired. And I was looking at these images of, men fighting and horses and things. And I thought I heard the sound of what was happening there. And I rationalized it. I was like, oh, I'm really tired. I knew I wasn't actually hearing it. But so we sometimes have these kinds of experiences where either because we are somebody who experiences synesthesia or we're really tired or whatever, but he's describing an environment where they're actually there. One sense says yes, one sense says no, right? You're actually in this environment where the senses are no longer discrete. I find that super interesting.
Now, we've talked about this off pod. I don't remember whether we've ever talked about it on the podcast, but you are the sort of person who, when you read, you form pictures of what you're reading in your mind. And I'm not. I don't generally do that at all. So I'm curious about how this interest in depictions of especially artwork in literature, they don't do as much for me because it's not like I'm making the picture of the picture being described. It's just a bunch of description that I have to make sure I don't miss whatever the important bit is. But it's not as directly sensual for me as it seems to be for you. So I'm curious just in general, because I know that ekphrasis is something you're big into. What else about it appeals to you?
Well, it's interesting when you say, like, you see images. I mean, I do, but like the kinds of images, I'm very spatially oriented. So if I'm reading something that describes like a physical layout or a geography or an itinerary or a map or any of these, like that kind of stuff, like I'm really drawn into that. I'd say. So if it's like sort of schematic, not so much like I couldn't tell you what Dido looks like. I couldn't tell you like that soft stuff. Like I don't see any of that, but stuff that's spatial or visual or like perspectival or, where it's about like relationality, where something is relative to something else. Like I just like immediately see that. One of these is probably like Dante a lot, right? Because the structure stuff, I really love that map, that mental map that it forms. And that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed W so much when we read that. Because you got a little bit of that kind of effect as well in certain parts of the text.
Oh, yeah. That was doing a lot of the same kind of work of just slowly exploring a space. I mean, again, to very different ends with very different, but like definitely thinking about the geography of the place that's being described as reflective of the culture of the place that's being described, or reflective of something greater anyways. You get that here as well. It's very schematically oriented in that sense.
Yeah, it's probably one of the reasons why I think when I read something, I mean, almost always, I'm really get absorbed into thinking about what is the structure of this? Like, how is it shaped? What is the beginning, middle, and the end? How many parts is it in? Like, and I guess that's a little weird. I guess maybe not everybody is that way, but I'm very much like, so I see it, but the way I see it is probably kind of weird. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like ekphrasis so much, because it has intensely complex spatial logic a lot of the time.
See, I like that stuff as well, but I have to constantly look at the map or draw out a map. I can't just picture it from reading it. So I'm constantly, when I'm reading the Purgatory, I'm constantly flipping back to the little diagram of what the mountain looks like and where all the different sections are and what the sort of in between sections might be and blah, 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 blah. Like I'm doing that here. I was doing that for the Inferno. I do that, if it's a fantasy novel, I read The Lord of the Rings recently and I was constantly getting frustrated with the map and having to find one online just so I could understand what was going on because I can't get that from the text as much.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's interesting.
But I definitely like having that sense of the schema and of the spatial relationships with things. It's just maps will give it to me. Text doesn't. Well, I think we're going to have to leave Dante and Beatrice behind until we tackle Paradiso, which frankly, I have no idea what we're going to talk about because I remember that being super boring, but I'm probably wrong. Hopefully we'll find something to say if we do it next year.
We'll find a way in.
Yes. In the meantime, we're going to be continuing next time around with our education cluster by looking at Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson.
I'm really looking forward to it. I haven't read that before.
I haven't either, but I've heard many, many people say many, many good things about it. And hopefully that book is not too hard for people to find. I'm not sure if it's in print in the US, but I think used copies are pretty available. So hopefully we didn't accidentally pick something super obscure. We try not to.
Oh, maybe this will provide a powerful argument for reprinting it. Exactly.
Let's start a Twitter campaign for, Vintage or whoever it is that owns the rights. In the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd always love to hear from you. Show notes with links for things that we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/34. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
see you again at the Spouter-Inn.